Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God for his word. Well, it might seem a little early, but I'm going to share a little story about Christmas with you this morning. I'm going to give you a sort of an outline of a story written by the great Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy called Papa Panov's Special Christmas. And it tells how this Papa Panov was a cobbler living in Russia, and it was Christmas Eve. He was finishing up his workday and could see the streets emptying out as people and children headed to their homes for the night. And as he, the village shoemaker, stepped back into his shop out of the street, he took down his Bible and began to read the Christmas story as he drank coffee and sat by a warm fire. And he thought about how if he had been there on the night of Jesus' birth, that he would have made room for Jesus. He would have allowed this baby to come into his own bed and covered him with his patchwork quilt to keep him warm. He read about the wise men who had come to bring gifts, and he thought about how he would love to have had a gift to give to Jesus. He took down a small dusty box from a shelf in his room and opened it up and found in there a beautiful pair of shoes, tiny little baby shoes that he had made some years before, and that he looked at them now and saw this was probably the best work he had ever done. Well, he was feeling tired now, and as he sat in his rocking chair and the fire was warming the room, he began to get very sleepy, and his eyes closed, and in no time at all, Papa Panov was fast asleep. And as he slept, he began to dream. He dreamed that someone was in his room, and he knew at once, although he couldn't put his finger on why, he knew at once that it was Jesus. "You've been wishing you could see me, Papa Panov," he said kindly. "So look for me tomorrow. It will be Christmas Day, and I will come to you tomorrow." Look carefully, for I will not tell you who I am." And so when Papa Panov awoke, he found that the thin morning light was already coming through his shuttered windows, and he awoke and said, "It's Christmas Day." He stood up and stretched himself and stretched out the stiffness of his joints, his face filled with happiness as he remembered his dream. This would be a very special Christmas after all, for Jesus was coming to visit him. He knew that he needed to have his eyes wide open. How would Jesus look? Would he be a little baby as on that first Christmas? Would he be a grown man, a carpenter perhaps? Or the great king that he is, God's son? Papa Panov knew he must watch carefully throughout the whole day so that he recognized Jesus however he came. Well, he put on a special pot of coffee for his Christmas breakfast and opened up the shutters and looked out the window. The street was deserted, it seemed. No one was stirring yet. No one except the street sweeper. He looked as miserable and dirty as ever, and well he might. Who would want to be out on Christmas Day sweeping streets in the raw cold and bitter freezing mist? So Papa Panov opened the shop door and called to him and said, "Come, share my coffee and get yourself warmed up a little bit." The sweeper looked up, scarcely able to believe his ears, and he was only too glad to come, put down his broom and come into the warm room, and sat and wrapped his cold red hands around a cup of Papa Panov's delicious coffee. He watched the man with satisfaction, but every now and then Papa Panov's eyes strayed to the window. He did not want to miss Jesus coming. "Are you expecting someone?" the sweeper asked, and Papa Panov told him about the dream. "Well, I surely hope that he does come to you," he said. "You've given me a bit of Christmas cheer I never expected to have. I'd say you deserve to have your dream come true." Well, when the sweeper had gone, Papa Panov put on some cabbage soup for his dinner, then went out to the door again and scanned the street. At first he saw no one, but realized that he had been mistaken. There was a very thin, waif-like young girl coming up the street, holding a tiny baby wrapped in a thin shawl. Papa Panov's heart went out to both of them, and he said, won't you come in?" As he stepped out into the street to meet them. "You need a warm seat by the fire and a rest." The young mother let him shepherd her indoors into the comfort of the armchair. She gave a big sigh of relief. "I'll warm some milk for the baby," Papa Panov said. "I've had children of my own. I can feed her for you." And so he fed the baby with a spoon, the warm milk that he took from his own supply. Saw that her tiny feet were bare against the cold. He said, "She needs shoes." The girl replied, I can't afford shoes. I've got no husband to bring home money. I'm on my way to the next village to try to find work." And a sudden thought flashed through Papa Panov's mind. He remembered the little shoes he had looked at last night, that he had been keeping those for Jesus. But he looked again at the little feet and made up his mind. "Try these on her," he said, handing the shoes to the mother. Beautiful little shoes were a perfect fit. The girl smiled happily, and the baby gurgled with pleasure. "You've been so kind to us," she said when she got up with her baby to go. "May all your Christmas wishes come true." But the day was wearing on, and Papa Panov was wondering if his special Christmas dream was going to be just that, nothing but a dream. Maybe he had missed his visitor. He looked anxiously up and down the street. There were plenty of people about, but they were all faces that he recognized. Neighbors going to call on their families, nodding and smiling and wishing him a happy Christmas, or beggars. And Papa Panov hurried indoors to fetch them hot soup and a generous chunk of bread, hurrying out again in case he missed the important stranger. All too soon the winter dusk fell, and the streets began to empty. No longer could Papa Panov even make out any passers-by. Most were home now. He walked slowly back into his room at last and put up the shutters and sat down wearily in his rocking chair. So it had been a dream after all. Jesus had not come. And then all at once he knew that he was no longer alone in the room. This was not a dream, for he was wide awake. At first, he seemed to see before his eyes the long stream of people who had come to him that day. He saw again the old road sweeper, the young mother and her baby, the beggars that he had fed. And as they passed, each one said, "Didn't you see me, Papa Panov?" "Who are you?" he called out, bewildered. Then another voice answered him. It was the voice from his dream, the voice of Jesus. "I was hungry and you fed me," he said. "I was naked and you clothed me. I was cold and you warmed me. I came to you today in every one of those you helped and welcomed." Then all was quiet and still. Only the sound of the big clock ticking. A great peace and happiness seemed to fill the room, overflowing Papa Panov's heart until he wanted to burst out singing and laughing and dancing with joy. And all he said was, "He did come after all." Well, a wonderful story, I must say. And without a doubt, Papa Panov's generosity and his kindly actions towards those around him are most certainly a model for us of how we ought to treat kindly and generously those in need around us. The only question I have is about the theology of the story. And the question, is this actually what Jesus meant when he said in Matthew 25:40, these words we've heard this morning, "Just as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me." Today is the last Sunday of the Christian year, the day we celebrate the reign of Christ the King. And the central point of our gospel story is that Jesus is the King and the judge of all humans, all who have ever lived and all who ever will live across the history of this world. Today, on the final Sunday of the Christian year, we celebrate the reign of our Christ as King. We declare his universal lordship and sovereignty over the whole world. And in the story we've heard from Matthew, he is at the center. Jesus is the central figure on the throne, the one around whom all of this action is revolving. And what is this action? It's the judgment. It's the final evaluation of all human lives. What is the basis of this judgment? That is the question that makes preparing a sermon on this passage a real challenge. The commentators seem to be pretty much equally divided, and two of my favorite commentators take opposite positions on the question. Here is the question. Who is Jesus really referring to when he says all the nations in verse 32? All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people. And who, even more specifically, does he refer to when he says, "The least of these, my brothers," in verse 40? When you did it to one of the least of these brothers of mine, members of my family, you did it to me. Who is he referring to? And so throughout much of the 20th century, to give you a little bit of interpretive history of this passage, throughout much of the 20th century, commentators thought, for the most part, that what Jesus was referring to in all the nations in verse 32 was literally just that, every human being in the world, including all Christians. And along with that, many interpreters of this story say that the least of these means all of the poor and needy of the world, wherever and whoever they may be. No doubt this is the interpretation of this passage that most of us have heard. This is the interpretation that governs the story of Papa Panov, that he has this revelation that he has been encountering Jesus Christ through all of these poor and needy people that he's been ministering to throughout the day. Here's my problem with that interpretation. If it's really true, then what do we need Matthew 26, 27, and 28 for? Why are they there? What do we need the events narrated there for, these climactic events of Jesus' life and death and resurrection? If all that Jesus came to do in this world was to teach us to be kind and compassionate to the needy people around us, then what need was there for him to lay down his life? What need was there for him to die anyway? In fact, what good did that do? It just took him, a great helper of the poor and needy of the world, off the scene. How could the poor be helped by that? According to this interpretation, the standard of judgment that Jesus will use to judge each and every human being who ever lived and to separate the sheep from the goats is simply whether or not they showed love in practical ways to needy people around them. With this interpretation, Jesus would be saying that he can be encountered and be accepted in the person of those in need, wherever we may encounter them, and that everyone will be judged on the basis of whether they showed love to those needy people with whom they crossed paths. The judgment will stand whether or not anyone has ever actually known Christ himself or not. My dear friend and teacher, Roger Hahn, who passed away last month, wrote that for a number of years it has been popular to interpret this passage as if it were appealing to a general kind of humanitarian kindness to people in need. And in such a line of interpretation that I've been describing to you, there's no specific Christian or Christ-related content to the message of salvation. Many thought that this teaching simply promised salvation on the basis of our treatment of needy people. If we were kind to them, we would be a part of the sheep that would be welcomed into the eternal glory of God. If we're unkind to needy people and did not help them in the ways that he describes here, we would be a part of the goats that are sent to eternal punishment. But he goes on, prior to the 20th century, and again now in more recent years, Bible scholars recognize that when Jesus refers to these brothers of mine, inasmuch as you have done it to the least of these brothers of mine, or in the translation I read, inasmuch as you have done it to the least of these members of my family, Jesus is referring to his disciples, his poor and needy and vulnerable disciples who go out into the world with this message and who are often persecuted and often had to sacrifice greatly in order to send that message out into the world. And when at the beginning of the scene it speaks of all the nations being gathered for judgment, he says it refers to the peoples of the world who never heard of Christ or who never heard the story of the gospel and never came to faith in Christ. The question is, how will they be judged? That is the reason that is the meaning of this story, that I'm compelled to accept that when Jesus speaks of the least of these, he's referring to his disciples who go forth into the world with this message. And the people of the world will be judged based on their acceptance or non-acceptance of the disciples of Jesus. Elsewhere in Matthew's gospel, where Jesus refers to his brothers and sisters, he clearly means his disciples. For example, in chapter 12, verses 48 through 50, people come to him and say, your mother and brothers are waiting for you outside. They've come to talk to you. And he says, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. This passage in Matthew 25 seems to be almost a dramatization of what Jesus has said also in chapter 10, verses 40 through 42, where he's told his disciples, whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Whoever gives a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. So what does this all mean? Dr. Hahn continues, the point is that all the peoples of the earth will be judged on the basis of their response to the message of the kingdom of God. That message is always brought to them by Jesus' brothers, sisters, or little ones, his disciples. Readiness for Christ's coming does not happen simply by being kind to everybody. And so rather than being a story about what we should do, and indeed we have already been told by Matthew numerous times that we should be kind and compassionate to the needy people around us, but it turns out that for Matthew's original readers, who were almost undoubtedly a trodden down company of very vulnerable disciples who were coming under persecution, this would have been for them a message of great comfort. Jesus' earliest followers were often downtrodden, often persecuted, often treated with contempt. Generally, they were at the very bottom of the social pecking order, struggling to remain faithful to Christ against great social and political pressure. And so for that little vulnerable community to be told that the rich and powerful and often contemptuous people around them would be judged finally and in the end on the basis of how they treated this little community of vulnerable Christ followers, it would have been a message of great encouragement to them. They could stand in the face of persecution and opposition, knowing that if they were persecuted and pressured to give up their faith, those doing the pressuring and the persecuting would ultimately be held accountable for their actions. And the most outstanding feature of this story, when we understand it in this way, is this astonishing bond of intimacy that Jesus describes and establishes here between himself and his disciples, these needy and suffering disciples. He identifies himself fully with them to say that the things that they do to you, they are doing to me. There are so many implications to that reality that Jesus sets forth here. It means, first of all, that if you are a disciple, then Jesus is never closer to you than when you are at your most desperate point of need. He identifies himself with you completely. He is with you. He is in you. He feels every blow with which life is pounding you. But he is more than that. He is more than the suffering Son of Man. After suffering death, he conquered death. He is king and he is judge, and so he has the power to set things right in due time, and he will do so. There is always hope for us when we are experiencing suffering and finding ourselves vulnerable and cast out and oppressed and treated with contempt because of our faith and our witness. We may know that Jesus is with us in a profoundly intimate way. It means, I think, secondly, that you and I have the right to expect that we will encounter Jesus when we are together with other believers. Now, this means that in our desire to increase the depth and the strength of our relationship with Jesus, one way of doing that is to take steps to get closer to his people. Growing strong ties of love and trust with Jesus' disciples will bring us closer to him. Holding ourselves aloof from the fellowship of other believers may keep us at a distance from him as well. The third implication I see is that it means that as we serve poor and needy and destitute believers, Jesus receives those acts of love as directed specifically to him. And we should And should we neglect or ignore or turn a blind eye or a cold shoulder to them in their plight, we have done it to him. One of the greatest ways we can serve the purposes of God in this world is by learning where we have Christian brothers and sisters in need and doing all that we can to minister and care for them. Let's pause a moment and dwell on that point for a moment. Dr. Ron Benefiel, in a sermon I heard some years ago, pointed out that there are at least 4 levels of care that are described here in what Jesus says you did to me, to the sheep. There's stewardship, giving to them to help their need. He says, for I was hungry, you gave me something, whether it be food or water or clothing, you gave this to me. And so stewardship is a part of our response in faithfulness to this text. We should give generously for the compassionate care of those in the household of faith as well as those beyond it. A second level of care that we can discern here is the ministry of presence, going to be with them in their distress, not holding ourselves aloof, but going. He says, you came to visit me. It's good to give, but where possible, it's even better to go and spend time with destitute people. A third level of the care that the sheep have given is the ministry of hospitality, welcoming into one's space. I was a stranger and you took me in. This is a powerful and challenging act of ministry to take others into our space. How alert are you to the fact that someone sitting near you today could be drowning in loneliness? Are you willing and able to open yourself to new relationships which might bring help to others as you welcome them into your space? Hospitality is powerful, and it is a beautiful gift. And a fourth level of care that the sheep have given to Jesus through his followers in this story is the level, we might call it compassion, that is feeling with their pain, or maybe the word solidarity comes to mind, being distressed with their distress, identifying with them in their situation of need. And often there may be a strong sense of shame or disgrace about being in the situations that Jesus describes, being hungry, being without adequate clothing, being in prison, being sick. All of these are isolating kinds of predicaments to be in. But the righteous people in this picture are not intimidated. They do not give in to the aura of exclusion or suspicion that seems to sometimes surround people in need. Well, a final implication that I see in this story is that it means that Christ has ordained that throughout these long centuries of history, people will encounter him and the message of his gospel through the community of his disciples, even though we are sometimes not a very impressive lot. I mean, isn't that strange? Maybe a more conventional way of thinking would be that he would want his disciples to be the people in society who are obviously on their way up. People who apparently have everything together, have life all figured out. We're getting along just fine. But no, these people, the least of these, my brothers, are at the bottom of the social pecking order. They're not always the kind of people who folks are impressed with automatically. I mean, they're kind of like him. They take a licking and keep on ticking. But all the nations of the world will be judged by how they responded to this community of Jesus' followers. And for us, living all these centuries later, and no longer a community that is oppressed and downtrodden as Jesus' original followers were, how do we hear this story? Across the centuries, we Christians, at least those of us in Europe and North America, have often found ourselves more like on the top of the social pecking order. We have all too often used power to oppress rather than to serve. We've used power and worldly standards to measure our power and success and so-called effectiveness. May we recognize today that our call is not to dominate, not to conquer, not to somehow prove ourselves better than anyone else, but our call is to love and to serve our neighbor. We already know where to find the presence of Christ. We find the presence of Christ in the Word and in the sacrament. We find the presence of Christ in the Holy Scriptures. We find the presence of Christ in prayer. We find the presence of Christ in the fellowship of other believers. So maybe we can understand the story of Papa Penov in a slightly modified way. And I will leave you with this. As we serve others in the same way that Papa Penov did, we are giving those people the opportunity to encounter the presence of Christ in and through us. He wants to reach out to them through us. And this is the way that we glorify him and that we witness to him in the world. May we be faithful to that calling today and every day.